This is episode 237 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. Well, Wally, another eventful week. And of course, we are hurtling towards Election Day. Thankfully, President didn't have another debate this week. Of course, who knows? Maybe when he was debating Joe Biden, he was so fired up and angry because his body was in the throes of the coronavirus that he ultimately had. And now it seems like he is rapidly on the path to recovery. He's back at the White House. So I don't know. For a 74-year-old man with a little bit of a weight problem, he seems to have come through with flying colors. Of course, people's experiences with the coronavirus apparently vary widely. So, very interesting week.
Yes, and it is interesting. Trump, he is a force of nature. The other thing that's interesting is, you read a lot about. There's always stuff written about the president, but they did throw a lot of remediation his way. He was taking a lot of things. They put the everything but the kitchen sink, but evidently it worked. And he, in the words of the Jack Nicholson line, "I'm back." So
yeah, so very quick recovery for the president, and we're all happy that he is feeling hearty and hale. He is going to need every bit of that energy in the next several weeks in order to get reelected. It is looking like a challenging playing field for Mr. President, but our governor is also potentially in the same boat. Allegedly, she was exposed to the virus. It looks like she's self-quarantined, and she is at least concerned enough by this situation that she has quarantined for the time being, I guess, until she's able to confirm whether she has the virus or not. But yeah, it's the politicians, of course, in Washington, D.C., a lot of them who were around Trump, and apparently the Amy Coney Barrett press conference, ironically enough, was one of the vectors. I guess the super spreader event is what they're calling these things these days. But that is a very timely situation in Washington with regard to getting a Supreme Court justice on the bench. And of course, Chuck Schumer and the Democrats are eager to make sure everyone quarantines for about the next month, and they don't put Amy Coney Barrett through. But yeah, I guess if the governor does have coronavirus, that would throw another wrench in the whole situation here with the narrative of who is being careful, who is not, who's getting the virus and who's not, et cetera.
yes, and and this is no criticism of the governor of this part. Is she is definitely the Zoom governor, so I'm not sure to the extent that she's feeling well and doesn't come down with symptoms. I don't think it'll impact her, as much as it would have impacted Trump from a campaign point of view.
Certainly not.
But yeah, so we'll see how that happens. But yes, it is a virus and it is easily spread. That has certainly been proven true. The other thing is I look at the virus. It can go away very quickly and it can come back very quickly. And it seems like most places that have been very smug about their level of infection early on, they tend to take their turn in the barrel in terms of having a problem. It's not like you can run forever, at least the current stage of treatment and vaccines and so forth, or lack of vaccine, I guess you would say.
Yeah, and just to be clear, the governor did have an update this past week. Nothing really changed. She is concerned about the rate of spread increasing again. That is not unique to New Mexico. It's something that's happening in many areas across the country. And you're right, Wally. Regardless of the status of how locked down or non-lockdown you are, New York is having issues again. New York City. So we're looking at potentially more ratcheting back in terms of more lockdowns, less freedom, and I hope that is not the case in New Mexico because we have been notoriously slow to reopen. It's hard to pin down a relationship between states that have lockdown in a pretty draconian nature, and I'd qualify New Mexico in that regard, and states that have been relatively laissez-faire or relatively open. And so it is a virus, and people will spread it, and it seems that we're just going to continue to learn more and more about this virus, and hopefully we'll have a vaccine and we can dispense with some of this virus watching. But it's really hard to figure out a public policy that actually works to address the virus as a long-term issue. Of course, Rio Grande Foundation, we are believers in personal freedom. And this is kind of where a philosophical approach, I think, has more merit to it. Yeah, there's a few weeks, flatten the curve to make sure the hospitals aren't overwhelmed, that kind of thing. But overall, we believe in individual liberty. We believe in the Constitution. And that is why we came to a conclusion early on that we wanted to reopen New Mexico and not keep it closed. And ultimately, that's the approach we took. And I think having a philosophical underpinning, whether you're a think tank or a politician, it can help you kind of pull through in some of these crisis situations.
Yes, and one of the philosophical points as to whether the virus is managed by broad conceptual policy or very minute detail where there's a lot of differences or distinction without difference. And it seems like New Mexico's taken that. It's hands-on. We get down into the nitty-gritty and make some decisions that are, I don't know if they're just not explained or potentially not explainable as to why one business that's very similar to another is treated completely differently.
Yeah, and this week we saw that writ large. Well, a couple times. Last week on this podcast, we praised the governor somewhat for reopening, at least we thought, reopening bowling alleys. Now, I will say that I did my on-the-ground research on that because I had told you, Wally, that I'd planned to take my kids to the bowling alley last weekend, so this past Sunday. Unfortunately, when I called around to various bowling alleys, they were only open for league play. And, each bowling alley has different rules in their leagues, and I couldn't quite sign up my children for a league on the spot. That wasn't an option. I'm sure we could have worked something out if an innovative bowling alley had kind of thought things through. But the fact is we are not league bowlers, and so we were not allowed to go bowling. So I would say that mostly our bowling alleys in New Mexico outside of military installations are still closed unless you are in a league. And then the really wacky and strange distinction that the governor is making is, when Mayor Tim Keller and his progressive politics are in conflict with our governor and her progressive politics, it really shows you that the governor just is very, very aggressive in her policies and often without rhyme or reason. The city of Albuquerque owns both the zoo as well as the biopark. The zoo has an exhibit with penguins in it, behind glass, in large tanks of water, and people walk in and go look at them. Wally, have you been to the penguin exhibit yet?
I have not been to the penguin exhibit.
Are missing out. It is a very nice exhibit. Yeah, I realize
now,
that.
Can I go, or is
you can go? The penguins are open.
Okay, good. I'll have to go see the penguins.
I believe penguins have a special force field of immunity to the coronavirus that spreads to human beings, and that's why they are open. I'm being facetious here. But the aquarium, also owned by the city, but down the road at the biopark, which is more garden, and that's where you do the River of Lights and whatnot. The aquarium is still closed because apparently the aquarium was specifically spelled out in the governor's orders saying aquariums are not allowed to reopen.
Aquariums, plural, in New Mexico?
I believe that is really the only public aquarium.
Yeah, that's the only
state.
one I know of. There may be another one.
Yeah, and it's a lovely thing.
Yeah,
we go to
it's
it all
fantastic.
The time, but
yes.
It is still closed because apparently fish have a mysterious impact on coronavirus that they push it back into the human body and cause illnesses that way. So you could almost take the penguins out of the out of the penguin exhibit and stick them in the aquarium, and stick all the fish in the penguin exhibit, and it would not you wouldn't notice a big difference in terms of the physical environment that the human beings walking through are in. But yes, in this topsy-turvy world here in New Mexico, one is legal and open and the other is not, and it just makes no sense whatsoever.
I have nothing to add other than yes, amen.
I hate to
I
say,
can see that. So
yeah, and recently, I believe I talked about it on a recent podcast. I had an opinion piece in the Santa Fe New Mexican and Las Cruces Sun News, questioning the governor's policies and the lockdown, and pointing out some of the same things, although these recent policies have only recently come about, and I didn't criticize them specifically in the op-ed. But somebody in the Santa Fe New Mexican said, basically, what's Gessing's plan, or what's the Rio Grande Foundation's plan? And I would just remind folks that we had a plan back in April called Fairly Open, fairlyopen.com. Really, it's essentially Fairly Open New Mexico. And the basic idea here is that we should allow small businesses to reopen at the same standards applied to big box stores. And that was a big deal at the time. So there's a little bit of dating here, but basically the idea is to allow businesses or institutions like the aquarium to open at a consistent basis based on whatever the best science is that's applied to other facilities similar in nature. Provide detailed plans for reopening, including health criteria to be used for businesses to reopen. We, of course, saw the governor disregard her own spread data and other metrics that she was using, whether those are indeed the best data or not. She was disregarding those when times were really good. Now they're not as good. And of course, that had nothing to do with her opening things unduly, because she really didn't. Of course, she'll blame Labor Day holiday, dang those 3-day weekends.
yes,
And it's always our fault whenever anything bad happens. And, it's just very frustrating. And then she should share her models and explain her decisions clearly and concisely to the people. And I really, I've watched those press conferences, and it just does not make sense. So go check out Fairly Open New Mexico. It's still relevant information, and we have had a plan in place since April. Unfortunately, our governor has not necessarily taken any cues from us or Power the Future, which we worked with on that plan.
yes, and it's interesting how there's politics is a game of finger pointing, and there's a lot of criticism that Washington and the Trump administration doesn't have a plan. Under our federalist system here, the states have a lot of control. And so, when you say, if those who would say there is no plan, maybe Washington is a little far to look to where these plans need to come from, given that the states have incredible power in dealing with the response to the COVID situation.
And I made that point in a recent radio interview, talking about President Trump, and he has indeed zigzagged many times on his own approach to the virus, and the whole fact that he did contract it. He was not a fan of wearing masks. He spoke kind of in a belittling tone about masks, and that's fine. But I do think if he had a consistent approach that he had implemented through his administration, saying, "Look, we are a different country from virtually any other country across the globe. We have a federalist system in place. We are going to help. The federal government is. We're going to clear the brush and the regulatory burdens to get a vaccine. We're going to do our best to provide PPE and ventilators and all the various things that have been used to help people recover from this virus. But it's ultimately the states who are making the policies, because a one-size-fits-all policy for South Dakota doesn't work the same as New York, for California, for New Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. I wish that the president would have taken a more kind of principled approach and said, look, also, by the way, when states shut themselves down, they are shutting their own economies down, and the federal government is not going to, maybe a small, reasonable bailout at some point, maybe, with the airline industry in mind and some various heavy impacted industries, but not a broad-based set of bailouts that are going to happen. We've already had $2.2 trillion, which is unprecedented completely. Back in the olden days, 2008, $700 billion was a really big deal. Now we're
Right.
talking triple that size, and we're still looking for more potential bailouts. So that, just because we've disagreed mostly with the governor, we focus on state policies here at the Rio Grande Foundation, doesn't mean we see what's happened in Washington as completely above reproach. It is a virus. It's a very tricky thing to get your head around. But again, it gets back to having those strong principles. And, the governor's principle seems to be, well, to quote John Friesling, governor knows best.
Yes.
That's her principle.
Well, yes, and it's one of those. There's no question is there can be a more hands-off policy basis, in which case, as a politician, you might not own the outcome in terms of the virus spreading. I do believe the governor has purchased and holds dearly the outcome, and it's one of those. It's been okay, although there have been some horrible exception on the Navajo Nation in northwest New Mexico. And as I look forward, one thing looking back, one thing looking forward. Looking back, if we look at the United States and they say, oh, the United States is doing terrible, take New York out of the situation. The U.S. is doing quite well compared to all industrialized and non-industrialized countries in the world. And then the other thing I'm not looking forward to in terms of how you look forward to Easter or Christmas, but when these vaccines come out, we're going to see a lot of politics around that in terms of will it be required? There's the ability to require vaccines, and then depending on who's in the White House, if a Republican is in the White House, does that mean Democrats are less likely to want to take the vaccine and become anti-vaxxers and other way around? So, I'm not sure that this vaccine is going to be an immediate and effective and wonderful thing. I think we have a long time to go until that really gets to the point where it solves the problem, or at least minimizes at the point where it's not at the front of almost every person's everyday life here in America. So,
yeah, and if you go to the World-O-Meters coronavirus tracking page by state, and of course, we've said it all the time consistently, deaths per million population is the relevant statistic. New Mexico is at 23rd. We're at 24th in the World-O-Meters, but District of Columbia is included, and they're higher than us. So we're 23rd most deaths per million. So we're not spectacular. We're not terrible. And yes, you remove the Navajo Nation, we look a lot better. You remove New York from the United States, we look a lot better.
Yeah.
You can play these games all day with the United States and other countries around the world, and it makes the results look very different. And I just, it is what it is. And I just don't think you can point to one state or another that said, we've gotten the approach, the lockdowns worked, or any of that those kinds of statements simply have not panned out to date. And
they pan out for a period of time, and then they completely
exactly.
switch.
You're right.
So
now, what has panned out is that New Mexico's economy has been massively impacted. That virus science is something that's very much in the works. Economic science, for all of its many flaws, is very straightforward. And if you shut down your economy, you will not have much of an economy to generate tax revenues and to have businesses in the state. And New Mexico Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham recently presented at the NAIOP, National Association of Industrial Office Properties. They're a very active chapter here, and she did a Zoom presentation to them. The title was Kickstarting New Mexico's Economy. How can business help? And the title nearly made me get upset at my stomach. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, give me some other titles. How would you have entitled that presentation, Paul?
I would have entitled it how Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham can get the boot of government off the necks of businesses to allow them to restore New Mexico to freedom and prosperity. But businesses want to help. Businesses of all stripes, whether they've been totally open or totally shut down during this whole crisis, they would love to get back into something resembling normal. I realize that the governor may or may not have come up with that title, even in her, taking it from her paradigm. So
Yes.
if I'm the governor, I would say reopening New Mexico's economy, how the state and private sector businesses can collaborate to do so safely and successfully, something
Yes,
along those
yes.
lines. Hopefully, that was just a brain fart by somebody at NAOP or the governor's office, because the idea that business is doing anything but trying to reopen and help. Yes, you get an occasional, it's
There's a rogue business out there.
Yeah.
There's a few. You know what? There's rogues in every walk of
Exactly.
life, but not very many out there.
exactly. So I don't know how the presentation went. I do know that we'll talk a little bit more about the economic data later on in the podcast. But one of the businesses, quote unquote, that has been severely limited through this entire process is education. And we're going to leave aside the very significant impacts on the children, which is really, I think, the main issue that we should be focused on in the shutdown of our education system. But yet again, another judge, this time a federal judge, ratified the governor's approach to the virus, and whether she's treating businesses fairly or unfairly. In this case, businesses being private educators and public educators. Public education is open up to 50%, and a lot of districts are still virtual, completely virtual, but not all of them are. And private schools are only open 25% capacity. And the ruling, I read through a news article about the ruling, and sometimes news articles don't do it justice, but I just could not figure out the thread of logic that the judge made their decision with. Basically, they said something along the lines of when because 7th to 12th graders are not at all allowed in the classroom right now across the state of New Mexico. And they basically said that if 7 to 12 graders are allowed back in the classroom, then the private schools will have a better case. I don't get it, but maybe there's some weird logic within the law that caused this judge to rule this way.
But we don't labor with the burden of a Juris Doctor and a membership in the bar. So yes, I certainly didn't read that, but I will take your word for it, because yes, sometimes legal logic is not necessarily like other logic.
Normal logic,
Yes.
The more interesting aspect of that case, aside from yet another unfortunate defeat here in New Mexico, or deference to the governor and her, I think, overreach, or at least the law being allowed to enable her to overreach, is the Lujan Grisham administration argued in this case that there is, quote, no fundamental right to in-person education in New Mexico. And
That's because when New Mexico became a state, the Constitution was drafted with Zoom in mind. They were that
visionary.
They were visionary. They knew about Zoom. They knew the internet was coming. It wasn't Al Gore. It was the crafters of the Constitution in New Mexico.
Oh, I forget the guy's name, but the author of Ben-Hur.
Yes,
Wallace.
Lou Wallace.
Yes.
He knew.
All right. Well, all I can say about this is that we have this Yazzie lawsuit out there that requires an adequate education in New Mexico, and that is a standing decision still being addressed by the state. Apparently, adequate and in-person are very different things. I suspect that if there was another approach being taken, that the same people arguing that Zoom education is adequate would not be saying this if there was a a governor like Susana Martinez, who is advocating for enhanced use of virtual learning, et cetera. But uh, it is very interesting to see the mental gymnastics being undertaken right now by predominantly folks on the left who right now support are full throttle supporting tapping the permanent fund for more pre-K spending, more expansion of the education system, and yet at the same time they are perfectly comfortable with students who are in the current education system being given what I think for most of them is a very inferior product. There's I'm on the board of a virtual charter school. Virtual schooling can be done right for some children some of the time, but it's not a universally acceptable form of education. Certainly, there's areas in New Mexico that don't have adequate internet connection just for that alone to make it work. So,
Well, inadequate in this education discussion, particularly with regard to the Yazzie suit, has tended to not focus on outcomes. Is
right,
education happening? It's more of the inputs, how much money is
right.
being put in. So that's the whole other thing. So adequate and in person, it's like, let's take those and set those aside and say, what is the academic performance of the education system across the board, however it's being provided?
Yeah, and it is unfortunate that when it comes to especially education, but so many government programs, it's not what are we getting for the money we're spending. It's how much money are we spending. That is the measuring stick that we use to determine whether we care enough about X, Y, or Z.
Right.
So it is one of the many challenges here in New Mexico because when it comes to results, often more money does not lead to better results. Now, something that could potentially require more money is the purchase of an automobile, and that could be right here in New Mexico sooner than later. Of course, California's governor made, I assume, international headlines. He certainly made national headlines that he is going to ban gasoline-powered vehicles by the year 2035. Now, that's smart move by
Yeah, he'll
yeah
be long gone,
yeah
so he'll get all the kudos, assuming that you're a person that would want to give him kudos for such a
absolutely.
forward-thinking
When
policy.
Elon Musk comes up with a super battery that's able to power cars and be green and do all the wonderful things, Gavin Newsom can say, "Yeah, I was the guy that had that vision way back in 2020, and said we were going to go on a glide path to eliminating the internal combustion engine from California." Our governor made the decision to, by 2022, move forward to 52 miles to the gallon. That is the fuel standard that she just last year, a little bit, back in September of 2019. So we're not talking a long time ago. She didn't so much as issue an executive order or any formal legal advisory on this, but she said by 2022 model year, vehicles in New Mexico sold were going to achieve this higher miles per gallon standard. Now, we just kind of at the Rio Grande Foundation, we're questioning what happened because politicians often make promises, and sometimes we, as in you and I, and a lot of liberty-minded folks, hope they forget about them. And this
Yes.
is one that we certainly hope that long-term is forgotten about. But we're talking next year. By this time, automakers will be selling those 2022 model year vehicles, and we think that New Mexicans should wonder and ask, and somebody should be asking, what's the status of this particular promise? Is this actually something that we're going to do as a state? But we haven't heard anything from the governor, and this is a very much a looming proposition. And it's one thing to do it when times are great, oil and gas money is flowing in, but it's another thing to do it when unemployment's in the double digits. And I don't know. We're just asking that question, Wally.
Yes, so at this point, it has all the legal standing of the king and I. So it has been written, so it shall be done. Hopefully, this will go away. It's one of those. The other thing is that until it's easy to say things like that. Well, what does it include? Business cargo vans, pickup trucks, other vehicles like that. But just for passenger cars alone. 52 miles per gallon is a pretty darn aggressive. That would, uh, the last I was at a car dealership, that would mean you're probably in the small hybrid is
Hmm.
about the only thing that could be sold under that. And, you know, the thing about New Mexico is it is a voluminous, it is a big place. You know, electric cars, even if they were more affordable, the battery and charging infrastructure both have their downside. So something is going to have some gasoline in it, and I think a hybrid's the only way. Hybrids are not really too popular, in spite of the fact that they actually work relatively well. Their market share is not, it's not like that's the consumer making that choice. So something's going to come to a head, or maybe more positive for the state of New Mexico is that this will just taper off, and we'll deal with it at another time.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see whether this just goes down the memory hole or if it is something that maybe the governor remembers suddenly after the election of 2020 is in the rear view mirror. But it is worth noting that on a Zoom meeting, yet another Zoom meeting here this week, the governor, uh, in making a presentation to the climate change organization, she made a statement that New Mexico should transition away from fossil fuels. This is the U.S. Climate Alliance. Again, California Governor Gavin Newsom was on the Zoom meeting, a handful of governors from around the West. And yeah, this is all posted at airsoфenchantment.com. And we even point folks to the actual video. The presentation was made on Wednesday, September the 23rd. And the governor says, yeah, we should transition out of fossil fuels, which, Wally, as we do head to this election and beyond, I think anybody who does business or lives in New Mexico and cares about the private sector economy has to be wondering what will happen in the 2021 session and beyond if the legislature moves to the left, and the Democratic Party certainly has moved to the left. Whether the entire legislature, how successful the Republicans are, is an open question. But you know, when times were good in the oil patch, the governor was their best friend. She loved the money flowing into the state's coffers, and that was 40% of the budget. Now, it is undoubtedly a different time. The price of a barrel of oil is down, production's somewhat down, and it just seems to me that the environmentalists who support our governor and the Democratic Party in general are not going to be content with shutting a coal-fired power plant or two down in the Four Corners. They're going to be coming for the big kahuna and kick them,
Nat,
kick them while they're
gasoline
down.
and here's the thing. So, they talk about we're going to be carbon free by certain dates. When you're talking about the utility industry, electricity, a couple of things. One, I think that means that the New Mexico gas companies of the world may have to, they may have to leave. But if you're just talking electricity, that's one thing. But where are fossil fuels used? They're used for heating in the form of natural gas. And number one, wait for it, cars and trucks, shipping, the whole gamut of transportation, much tougher nut to crack. And we do have these what I call aspirational regulations coming into place. We have no idea how we're going to get there, but when it hits the fan, a lot of these are having at as they've been put in place in Europe and other places, they've had to back away from them once you see how unrealistic they are and the damage that is done. So I have no delusions that any of these high minded proclamations will ever come to fruition. But the way they know they've gone too far is it starts to shut the economy down, and people leave the state. In the case of the United States, go everywhere else, and they're like, okay, we went too far on that. We need to back it off and slow this down a little bit.
Yeah, you get a lot of confusion sometimes, even among relatively informed people, about what various fossil fuels are used for. And oil is used in some New England areas, parts of northeastern part of the country. that use oil for electricity generation, but by and large, the rest of us use some combination of nuclear, coal, and natural gas with some renewables tossed in. And on my way over here, Wally, I was driving down I-40 and saw some windmill blades. Of course, the mining of those blades and all the metals and everything has to be done with fossil fuels. But setting that aside, the manufacturing processes, those semi tractor trailers were most definitely not electric powered semi trailers. They were fossil fuels. So even the renewable industry, such as it is, gets a lot of its inputs and transportation from the fossil fuel industry. And this is kind of high-minded theoretical rhetoric that we're much more used to politicians putting forth. 52 miles to the gallon by 2022 is a much more particular and challenging approach to public policy, and we'll see if she does that. Speaking of challenges that come up, sorry.
Oh no! Before we leave that, I just and
Yes.
I'll post it in the show notes, tippingpointnm.com. There's the Lawrence Livermore energy flow chart that in sixth grade it's where do babies come from. This is where does energy come from and where does energy go. And it's a fantastic chart. It takes the whole United States and it shows all the sources of energy from a source point of view. Petroleum, natural gas, nuclear, renewables, and then where it goes through the economy. It's pretty easy to understand. So you've probably seen it, but I found that's the best chart to just say, oh, okay. So here's where the real issue is that we have to work on if we're serious about changing the emissions and the sources of energy in the United States.
Yeah. Yep. That is a useful chart. I know what you're talking about. All right. Well, speaking of policies that looked really fun and exciting when unemployment rates were really low and the oil and gas industry was booming, we have the governor and the legislature. Now, remember, this was a compromise at the time in 2019, but the minimum wage is going up at the end of 2020 in New Mexico. It's going to be, as of January 1st, 2021, $10.50, with the following year going to $11.50. After that, in 2023, to $12. Now, that plausibly could be fine if you're close to full employment and things are really booming in New Mexico. But I will remind people, once again, we are at 11.3 unemployment in the state. I suspect we are not going to get anywhere near 5% by the end of the year. And there's plenty of businesses that are struggling, and more, theaters and airlines are laying off people all the time. So I suspect we are going to be in a long-term economic struggle, let alone a virus-related struggle. And, it's just policies that seem really nifty and fun when times are great, then things change. And I think this is going to be a tremendously harmful wage increase, mandated wage increase, that is going to happen at the end of the year. I really suspect that the governor will do nothing to address it. Of course, she's spending all her time trying to convince businesses to do their part to get New Mexico's economy going, let alone what the government's boot on the neck of businesses is doing. But referencing previous talker in the podcast here. But I suspect that the governor will allow the minimum wage increases to continue. And, this is kind of a 1-2-3. I wish I could say it was just a 1-2 punch for business, but I think up to now we're talking about more of a Mike Tyson situation. We're a 5th or 6th punch in.
Yes.
And they're heavy punches at this point. And this will be a difficult blow for a lot of those businesses, especially small ones, but certainly not limited to them in terms of how they move forward economically in New Mexico.
Well, and one of the other punches that I think is going to be huge that, frankly, may be as big of a weight on economic recovery as these minimum wage increases, possibly a lot larger, is the unemployment insurance. That fund is out of money. And so, where does the money come to replenish that? And so we've talked on the podcast before, if that comes in the form of draconian raises in unemployment insurance for employers without a period of time to allow for that, or additional monies coming from the CARES Act and other places that potentially could be used to restore that fund, but in New Mexico hasn't. You're going to be faced with higher minimum wage to hire people, lots higher unemployment insurance potentially. And the thing about the minimum wage is, at least when you pay that to an employee, the employee is getting it right then, and it tends to be a motivator. In terms of maybe you could get a better employee if the wage is higher. Not getting into all those arguments. But that unemployment insurance is just like money you're putting into the system.
Mm-hmm.
That, yeah, is there a benefit for it? Yeah, but you as an employer don't see it right then. And certainly the employee you're just hiring doesn't see that is a big factor, and doesn't give you any credit for those rates being a lot higher.
No doubt. Now, there are several items that I would like to have discussed, but we are just going to run out of time here. The Rio Grande Foundation, however, has joined the New Mexico Business Coalition and Power the Future New Mexico. We are circulating an online petition. You can find it at errorsoфenchantment.com. It is a change.org position, and we have the link right to it there. And the simple petition is that we are calling on the governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham, to give up her government paycheck until New Mexico's unemployment rate drops out of the 10 worst in the nation. Now, typically, New Mexico's unemployment rate is among the 10 worst in the nation, and that's just because of our leftist policies that we've enacted, lack of economic freedom, et cetera, et cetera. However, there's plenty of other states with inflated unemployment rates these days that New Mexico, if it were just to cautiously, reasonably start to reopen in a stronger, more forward-looking way than the governor has been willing to do to date, we could actually get our unemployment rate moving significantly in the correct direction, which is, of course, lower. But to date, the governor has not done that. And, the idea, we're all in this together. We all want to pitch in. Well, governor is just one of many government employees who has not really been impacted by the virus and the lockdowns. She, as a government employee, the governor has been doing just fine during this lockdown. And unfortunately, that is, I think, one of the reasons the pressure has not built as it may in other states on the governor to reopen New Mexico, because so many people in this state are getting federal or state paychecks or local government paychecks. And it's like, I'm okay. I may be working hard. I may not be working hard, but I'm getting a paycheck because I am getting that sweet, sweet government dollars. Those government dollars flow into my paycheck. So,
the flow of milk and honey.
yep. So sign the petition. We're already close to 1,000. I think we'll move comfortably past that in the not too distant future. And finally, on the economy, the Legislative Finance Committee met this week, and Jim Peach, he's an economist out of New Mexico State. I've met him. He's definitely on the left, but he's an interesting guy. Definitely one of those. The state and the Journal seem to settle on one economist over time that's kind of their go-to. And I think right now Peach is the go-to in the economics profession. Somebody I'm definitely reaching out to see if he'd be willing to come on the podcast.
And I don't want to jinx it, Paul, but I found Dr. Peach to be approachable and a guy that you can absolutely have a conversation with. I've had many over the years. And so, hopefully he will come on and talk about, go a little bit deeper dive into some of the things that were in this journal article.
Yeah, and agree with him or disagree with him on his conclusions. He makes a lot of points that we've made here, and this will be kind of where we conclude the podcast. But he noted in his presentation that the pandemic has shifted business activity from smaller to bigger businesses. I don't think that's a real question. It's just a function of those big businesses. The big box stores initially were left open by the governor, while smaller businesses were not. And then, when you come to reopening businesses, often the big businesses have more flexibility and ability to respond to the virus and the governor's demands. Peach also noted that the demand for oil, obviously we talked about and talk about that regularly. Has not recovered and shows no signs of recovering. Commuters are working from home more. Air travel is way, way down and shows no signs of recovering completely. And then we see Mr. Peach talk about raising taxes. Now, this is obviously where we disagree with him, but he talked about the gas tax, which if you do put the money back into roads, I get that point, but if you're looking to fund the rest of government by raising the gas tax and you're just going to divert it into that, that is not going to sit well with a lot of people, including us. But
a la Europe,
yeah,
they're good at that.
yeah. And he got some pushback from Senator George Munoz, a Democrat, one of those few moderates that survived, who I was really thrilled with this quote in the Journal from George Munoz. "We have done a horrible job in New Mexico with economic recovery and helping business. Employers will simply leave the state if they face higher taxes." And after I picked my jaw up off the floor, I mean, George Munoz is a good guy, but he's still a Democrat and somebody who typically goes along with a lot of the policies that haven't worked out so great in New Mexico. And it's great to see him speaking out. Rebecca Dow, representative from TRC, also said she opposes raising taxes. She's pledged to the foundation not to raise taxes, and she has instead said that we should be cutting the Social Security tax. Peach also brought up income taxes, plastic bottle taxes, and a number of other opportunities. And we'll definitely want to try to get him on, see if he is retired. So sounds like the kind of guy who's more busy in retirement maybe than he was when he was working full time. But he is an approachable guy, and we'll just see if he's willing to come on the podcast. Certainly, we don't agree with a lot of those assessments, but or statements about what to do. We certainly agree with many of his assessments of the economy, and I think that's
a start.
yes. So we shall see. We've got some subjects that we just couldn't make it to, Wally, because darn it, so much is happening in this state and in our economy these days. But thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.